The sun beat gently down on the red earth of a small Lagos community as Esther Thomas, a modest woman in her 60s with greying hair neatly tied under a scarf, stepped carefully over uneven ground into an unfinished plot of land. The walls were only waist high, bricks stacked nearby, scaffolding leaning like promise against sky. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she belonged there. A man in a crisp suit approached her with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. Without a word, he handed her a folded sheet of paper. She took it with trembling hands, eyes squinting in the sunlight as she opened it. The title deed. Her name was printed at the top. Before she could speak, he smiled and said, "You taught them to pray. They never forgot. Now they're building you something that will outlive all of us." Esther's lips parted, but no words came. She turned slowly as another man unfurled a large white hand-gold banner across the edge of the structure. The letters were bold, elegant, impossible to miss. The Esther Grace Chapel, in honor of a woman who planted faith. A small gasp escaped her as her hand flew to her chest. Around her, others began to clap, neighbors, grown men and women she once helped raise, their children too. Some wore construction vests, others church clothes. All of them were smiling at her. Her eyes welled. Tears, quiet and deep, rolled down her cheeks as her hands trembled, fingers brushing against the deed again, as if to make sure it was real. Above the sound of celebration, her voice came, not aloud, but layered gently over the momentous, soft, steady voice that echoed with a lifetime of quiet endurance. I was only a maid, but my faith, ... it made room for me. And with that, the world blurred around her, colors fading into the warm golds and browns of memory. We drifted back to the rhythm of pounding fufu, the hiss of iron against fabric, the hush of whispered prayers in the servant quarters of a bustling Lagos mansion decades ago. The flashback had begun 20-5 years earlier. The Lagos sun had not shone kindly on Esther Thomas. She was 32, newly widowed, her husband buried under the weight of a failed promise and a failing economy, left with nothing but her daughter Amarette, years old and far too quiet for her. Esther found herself begging for work, any work. What came was a live-in maid position with the Daltons, an affluent family tucked behind high white walls. In the elite neighborhood of Ikoyi, it was far from ideal, but desperation didn't allow for preference. She accepted with bowed head and a stomach knotted in fear. From the start, the Daltons made the arrangement brutally clear. Mr. Dalton, a high-profile business tycoon, was rarely home and barely acknowledged her. Mrs. Dalton, always impeccably dressed and wrapped in perfume and judgment, had a gaze sharp enough to slice through dignity. "You're here to clean, cook, and disappear," she told Esther without blinking. "You're not family. Don't pretend otherwise." Esther merely nodded, her daughter clutching her hand tightly, eyes scanning the foreign world of marble floors and cold chandeliers. The Dalton children mirrored their environment. Caleb, 10, was already brimming with entitlement and anger, speaking to Esther as though she were furniture. Faith, 8, was the quiet middle child, watchful, her curiosity tucked behind wide eyes and hesitant steps. And Noah, the youngest, at 6, barely spoke at all. His presence often felt more than heard as he lingered silently around corners. Always observing, Esther's world became a rhythm of service and silence. She woke before dawn, scrubbed the floors, prepared meals, washed endless loads of laundry, and tucked Amara into the small cot they shared in the servants' room behind the kitchen. It was little more than a pantry cleared out, but Esther gave thanks for it anyway. Gratitude was her rebellion. Each evening, after the last dish was dried and the mansion fell into stillness, Esther would draw Amara close, their hands clasped together, and pray softly. Her voice, though worn from the day, never trembled in those moments. God sees us, my child, she'd whisper, even in corners where the world forgets. In time, the prayers grew into songs, soft hymns hummed beneath her breath as she ironed the Dalton children's school uniforms or swept under the heavy dining table. It wasn't loud or proud, just a quiet current of faith running through the margins of her day. One morning, as the house stirred to life, Esther knelt briefly in the corner of the kitchen before lighting the stove. Her lips moved in silent prayer, her eyes closed, her shoulders bowed, not in defeat but in reverence. When she opened them, Faith was there, standing at the threshold, watching. They locked eyes. Esther smiled gently, as if she had just caught a secret in the act of blooming. "You can talk to God too," she said softly. "Just speak from your heart. He listens." Faith didn't reply, but she didn't walk away either. And in that quiet moment, something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than employment contracts or marble walls, something like a seed, small but potent, falling softly into the soil of a young girl's soul. Esther didn't know it yet, but that seed would one day change everything. The rain came down in sheets that night, thick and violent, thrashing against the windows of the Dalton mansion like fists demanding entry. Thunder cracked across the sky, and in the dim-lit corridor, a scream tore through the silence. It was Faith. Her cries echoed from the children's wing, sharp and panicked. Mrs. Dalton was out at a charity gala. The other househelp froze, unsure of what to do. This was beyond chores, beyond cleaning and cooking. But Esther didn't hesitate. She dropped the mop in her hand and ran barefoot down the polished hallway, her heart pounding. She found Faith curled in a ball at the corner of her bed, hands over her ears, sobbing uncontrollably. The room flickered with lightning, casting ghostly shadows on the wall. Esther moved slowly, calmly, as if stepping into a sacred place. She sat beside the trembling child, placed a gentle hand on her back, and whispered, "You're safe. Breathe with me." Then, in a voice as soft as the rain on the roof, she prayed, "Dear God, I'm scared, but I know you're near. Stay with me." Over and over, until the sobs grew quieter, until Faith's breathing slowed, until she leaned into Esther's arms and clung to her like a lifeline. Later that night, after the storm had passed and silence returned, Esther tiptoed back to her servant's room, exhausted. But just before she reached her door, two small figures appeared in the hallway. Caleb and Noah, in pajamas, faces unreadable. Caleb, usually full of sarcasm, looked strangely solemn. "Can you teach us to?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Esther didn't answer right away. She simply opened her door and let them in. From that night, quiet prayers became a nightly ritual. Just 5 minutes, sometimes less of simple words, soft singing, and stillness. Something shifted. Caleb, once all sharp edges and fury, began to soften. He stopped yelling at the staff. He started apologizing. Faith, who used to hide behind walls of silence, began to speak freely, asking questions about life, about God, about kindness. And Noah, sweet, silent Noah, finally began to sleep through the night without waking from nightmares. But peace has a price, Mrs. Dalton eventually noticed. She walked in one evening to find all 3 children sitting cross-legged on the floor, heads bowed as Esther prayed with them. Her reaction was instant and thunderous. "What is this?" she shrieked, eyes blazing. "Are you poisoning my children with your village nonsense?" Her words were venom. Esther stood quickly, apologizing, trying to explain. But Mrs. Dalton wouldn't hear it. "You're fired," she shouted. "Pack your things. I won't have this backward superstition under my roof." The househelp scattered. The children cried out, begging their mother to stop. Then, from the stairwell, came a low voice, calm, measured. Mr. Dalton had returned early and heard the commotion. "Let her be," he said, eyes fixed on his wife. "If they want to pray, Let them. Mrs. Dalton stared at him, speechless, her fury losing footing. She turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. From that day on, everything changed. Esther wasn't fired. Instead, her moments with the children were quietly permitted. Every evening, she'd slip into their room after dinner. There were no sermons, no long lectures, just moments of peace, of stillness, of whispered prayers, and gentle words about kindness and courage. The children clung to it. They began to confide in her, trust her. Their worlds, once cold and walled off by wealth and neglect, began to open, and Esther, still sleeping in a servant's cot behind the kitchen, still scrubbing floors and ironing uniforms by dawn, found herself becoming something more than just a maid. In the stillness of those nights, she became their compass, their anchor, their quiet source of light. The air inside the Dalton household grew colder, though the Lagos sun still blazed outside. Mrs. Dalton, already distant, turned visibly hostile. Her eyes no longer skimmed past Esther, they bore into her, resentful. Suspicious chores became heavier, harsher. Esther was ordered to hand-wash the entire set of living room curtains twice in 1 week. She was made to polish already spotless floors with a toothbrush. Her pay, meager as it was, began arriving, late or not at all. And when Esther asked gently, the response was a clipped, "You're lucky to even have a roof over your head." The cruelty didn't stop with her. Amara, Esther's bright-eyed daughter, had been quietly enduring the increasing tension but the environment became unbearable whispers behind her back. Other house staff instructed to ignore her. Mrs. Dalton's icy looks that sent her scurrying to her mother's side. Eventually, with her heart breaking, Esther made the painful decision to send Amara back to the village to live with an aunt and attend school there. It was safer, less humiliating, but the separation split her spirit in two. Each night, after putting the Dalton children to bed, Esther sat on her cot in the tiny room behind the kitchen, holding Amara's worn sweater close, whispering prayers through the tears she would never let anyone see. One afternoon, Esther found Faith in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, shoulders shaking. The girl had just come from the sitting room, where her mother had publicly scolded her for quoting a Bible verse during conversation with guests. "We don't preach in this house," Mrs. Dalton had snapped. Faith's face was blotchy with tears when she turned to Esther and whispered, "You're the only one who listens to me." Esther held her for a long time, saying nothing, letting her silence say everything Faith needed to hear. That moment marked the beginning of something even deeper and even more dangerous. Mrs. Dalton's jealousy became venomous. She accused Esther outright of trying to replace her in her children's hearts. "You think you're their mother now," she hissed one evening. "You're just a maid. Don't forget your place." But it was clear to everyone, especially to her, that the children no longer confided in her. It was Esther they ran to when they were scared. It was Esther whose voice calmed their storms. One rainy night, Mrs. Dalton locked Esther out deliberately, told the guards she had forgotten her boundaries. The rain fell hard, relentless. Esther stood by the back gate, soaked to the bone, clutching her thin shawl tighter as water pooled around her feet. She didn't cry, she hummed, a hymn, soft and slow, slipping between her lips like breath. When the door was finally unlocked, in the early hours of the morning, she went inside, dried herself, and reported for duty scrubbing the marble floors, as ordered. While the rest of the house still slept, Mrs. Dalton watched her, furious that she hadn't broken. But Esther didn't break. She endured with a grace that was louder than defiance. She never stopped praying, never stopped teaching. If anything, the suffering seemed to deepen her well of peace. The children noticed. Caleb started waking early just to see her before school. Faith left sticky notes with Bible verses on Esther's bedside table. And Noah quiet, little Noah began, leading the morning prayer. They crept into her room before dawn, their feet silent on the tile, their voices sleepy but eager, just one verse, one whispered song, a moment of light before the day began. Esther knew she was treading a fragile line, that any misstep could end her time there. But she also knew something else. Seeds were growing, not in grand, obvious ways, but deep, quiet ones. The kind that couldn't be stolen, or punished, or silenced. So she stayed, through the cruelty, through the rain, through the heartbreak of distance from her own child. She stayed and kept planting, one verse, one prayer, one morning at a time. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day where the house felt half asleep. Mrs. Dalton was away, at a luxury spa in Lekki, unreachable and indulgent, her phone off. The househelp moved about lazily, music playing low. Esther was folding sheets when she heard a sharp, gasping sound, like someone choking on air. She dropped everything and ran. Faith was on the floor of her room, her face pale, her lips beginning to turn blue, her small chest heaving in tight, erratic spasms. Esther didn't wait. She called for someone to phone an ambulance, then dropped to her knees beside the girl. "Faith, look at me," she said, voice steady despite the panic racing through her. "Stay with me, okay?" She tilted her head back and began chest compressions, whispering prayers between each one, guiding her breaths, coaxing life back into the child's failing lungs. The seconds dragged like hours. By the time the paramedics arrived, Faith had started to breathe, shallow but steady. The paramedics nodded in approval as they took over. "She's lucky someone knew what to do," one of them muttered. Esther, drenched in sweat, her hands trembling, could only nod, overcome with a tidal wave of relief. That relief was short-lived by early evening. Mrs. Dalton stormed through the front door, rage radiating off her like heat. The driver must have told her what happened. She didn't ask if Faith was okay. She didn't ask who had saved her daughter's life. She went straight to Esther. "What were you doing while my child was dying?" she screamed, her voice shaking. "The walls. This happened on your watch. I should have fired you years ago." Esther tried to explain, tried to recount the CPR, the call for help, the sheer terror of watching a child she loved teeter on the edge. But Mrs. Dalton wasn't listening. "Get out," she spat. "You were never more than a risk in this house. I knew you'd bring trouble one day." The househelp stood frozen. The children, already gathered in the hallway, burst into tears. Noah sobbed uncontrollably, reaching for her. Faith, pale but stable, tried to hug Esther before she was dragged away by a guard Mrs. Dalton had summoned. Caleb stood silent, fists clenched, his eyes betraying more emotion than he'd ever shown. Esther walked out with a single bag. She didn't argue, she didn't defend herself, but her tears, quiet and bitter, traced a long path down her face. As she stepped into the compound, the door creaked behind her. Mr. Dalton, who had arrived just minutes before, stood there holding an envelope. He didn't say much, just handed it to her with a look that was part apology, part regret. Inside the envelope was 3 months' salary in crisp notes. Tucked between the bills was a single note, handwritten and simple. Asterisk, "You were the only real light in this house." Asterisk. Esther folded the paper slowly, placed it over her heart, and walked out of the house, not just a maid leaving employment, but a woman shedding years of quiet pain, and the world moved forward. The years stretched on, carrying the memory of a woman who had planted something sacred in hearts that once didn't know how to pray. 20 years had slipped by like pages in a well-worn book, and Esther Thomas now lived a quiet life in Ogun State. Her small one-room house was humble walls patched with care, the roof occasionally leaking in heavy rains, but it was hers, and it was peaceful. She cleaned part-time at a local school until her knees gave out, then retired, content to spend her days tending to a small garden and reading her weathered Bible. Amara, now a schoolteacher, visited every weekend with her 2 spirited children, who called Esther grandmama and loved her stories about faith, kindness, and songs that made them sleepy. Life wasn't easy, but it was filled with moments that mattered. One warm afternoon, as Esther swept the dusty porch, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the compound gate, drawing the attention of curious neighbors. Esther paused, broom in hand, her brows furrowed. The door opened, and out stepped a poised, elegant woman in her 30s. Esther stared, heart pounding, as recognition slowly dawned. Faith, Dalton her voice, her face, unmistakable, now grown into the fullness of womanhood. Behind her came 2 men, just as familiar, Caleb, tall and solemn, and Noah, still with those gentle eyes. Faith didn't speak at first. She crossed the short distance to Esther, tears already spilling down her cheeks. Then, without hesitation, she knelt at the elder woman's feet. "We searched for you for years," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave us something our mother never could piece. Hope, God, we never forgot." Esther stood frozen, her hands shaking, unable to speak, as Caleb stepped forward and added, "You changed our lives. We want to give something back." Faith continued, "We've built a church in Lagos, a real one, registered, beautiful, already growing. The Esther Grace Chapel. We want your name on it. We want you to lead the women's and children's ministry. You were the one who taught us how to believe." Esther blinked back tears as her hand flew to her chest. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only a long exhale like a prayer answered after decades of silence. Speechless, overwhelmed, she looked up to the heavens as if to ask, "Is this what you meant all along?" The broom fell from her hand, and the woman who had once been told to cook, clean, and disappear realized that her quiet faith had built something eternal. The sun rose gently over the city of Lagos, casting golden light on the white stone walls of the newly completed Esther Grace Chapel. Its doors were open, wide and welcoming, and already the sound of joyful worship echoed from within. Children ran across the courtyard, laughter ringing out as parents and elders exchanged warm greetings. Inside, the pews were filled with faces old, young, rich, poor, drawn by something more than curiosity. At the entrance hung a framed photo, slightly sepia-toned, of a young Esther Thomas in her maid's uniform, eyes bright and humble. Beneath it, the inscription read, "The woman who taught us to pray." Esther stood just behind the altar, dressed in simple white with a blue shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hair was silver now, her back slightly curved with age, but her presence was as steady and dignified as ever. As she approached the podium, the room quieted, reverent. She looked out over the congregation, her gaze falling on familiar faces. Faith, Caleb, and Noah seated in the front row, eyes shining with emotion. Behind them, Amara held her children close, her smile wide with pride. Esther placed her trembling hands on the wooden lectern and drew in a deep breath. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice when it came was clear. "I was just a maid," she began, letting the words settle like soft rain. "I had no money, no power, no voice, but I gave them my faith, and faith." She paused, her smile blooming slowly. It multiplied. The crowd stood in silence for a moment, some wiping tears, others nodding in quiet awe. Then a swell of applause rose, gentle at first, then thunderous as the room honored not just a woman, but a legacy. Esther closed her eyes for a moment, soaking in the presence of something sacred. Her journey, once hidden behind kitchen walls and servant doors, had risen to touch the heavens, and as the choir began to sing, the screen faded to black.